Fugitive slaves used a combination of courage, initiative, and motherwit to navigate. But the road to freedom was often long and treacherous, and many early escapes were unorganized and doomed to fail. But it did not stop them from trying. "I have seen hundreds of escaped slaves," said Harriet Tubman, "but I have never seen one who was willing to go back and be a slave. If a person would send another into bondage, he would, it appears to me, be bad enough to send him into hell if he could." As America moved steadily down the road to civil war, those who supported the movement toward freedom stepped up their efforts to undermine the rights of slaveholders. Free citizens, both black and white, who viewed slavery as the greatest immorality of the time, openly supported African American initiative. Step by step, they evolved a covert network of conductors, routes, and hiding places known as stations, all designed to assist fugitive slaves in getting north to the free states and even Canada. These pathways to freedom and the greater resistance movement became known as the Underground Railroad.
There was an often told story that it started around the mid-1830s after the building of the railroads started in this country. Some slave catchers were chasing a slave, and I believe the area was Ohio. And the slave ran away into a wooded area. And the slave catchers followed him there, and he suddenly disappeared. It was as if he ran away on an underground railroad. Well, it became a joke, but the joke caught on. When the abolitionists and the anti-slavery people got involved with helping slaves escape, they took that term on. And those who were helping slaves escape, they called conductors. These were the people who went right into slave territory and got the slaves and brought them out. And when they brought them out, they brought them to places where they could get food and shelter. And these places were houses or barns where abolitionists and anti-slavery people were at. And they called these houses stations. And the people who lived in these houses and who provided this information and this stuff, they called them station masters. And then others who became involved, like for example, they contributed money, they called them stockholders. And those who watched, they called them pilots. Any term that they used in the railroad, they used to describe the people who worked in the Underground Railroad.
Both runaway slaves and those who helped them faced harsh penalties if discovered. In most instances, conductors, agents, and station masters remained anonymous, and fugitives were forced to trust in information that was often hearsay, passed on in a whisper. That any first-hand information exists at all concerning activity on the Underground Railroad is due largely to the remarkable efforts of one historian who is said to have operated the Grand Central Station of Underground Railroad stops. William Still was a free black man who first began work in the office of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society in 1847 as a janitor and clerk. His greater abilities were soon recognized, and Still quickly rose to head the organization's General Vigilance Committee to aid runaway slaves. His duty as chairman was to keep a record of every fugitive that came to the committee, a mandate that brought him into contact with more runaway slaves than perhaps any other person on the Underground Railroad. Still interviewed hundreds of fugitives who passed through the office, meticulously recording the details of their escapes. Years later, in 1872, he would publish these eyewitness accounts in his massive landmark work, The Underground Railroad.
William Still, although he was a free man living in Philadelphia, his family had risks because his mother was a fugitive. Some of her children had been born in slavery. And if she were ever found out, or if the her owner had made a big attempt to come after her, she could have been returned to slavery too. So he was often leading a secret life. He had to keep the family history quiet while he was working. And he was at some risk of keeping all of these records too, because the records were clear evidence of this scale of help that they were giving.
William Still was at the hub of one of the Underground Railroad's most critical routes, the Eastern Line. It stretched from Maryland's eastern shore through the length of Delaware into the free state of Pennsylvania and on up to Canada. Most fugitives simply set out walking to freedom. At the onset of the Eastern Line, much of the landscape looked the same, making it easy to become lost, or worse, to unknowingly circle back. For obvious reasons, most fugitives traveled at night, navigating as best they could through treacherous terrain and winding waterways. And in truth, many were taught to look for the North Star and to follow the drinking gourd, another name for the constellation Big Dipper. Group travel was discouraged, as it might draw suspicion.
Do you run away with your children knowing that with a child along, your chances of success were greatly diminished? Especially, for example, if they were babies. I mean, how do you tell a baby not to cry?
A strong individual might make as many as 18 exhausting miles in one night before sunup.
Only about 5% actually made it to freedom in the North. They were primarily young males without family attachments.
One of the greatest supporters and station masters along this route was the formidable Quaker abolitionist Thomas Garrett. Thomas Garrett was headquartered in Wilmington, Delaware, the last stop to freedom on the Eastern Line. As a young man, he successfully intervened in the unlawful kidnapping of a free black woman who worked for his family. From that moment on, Garrett committed his life to abolishing slavery. Like abolitionist Nat Turner, John Brown, and Harriet Tubman, Garrett believed he was divinely inspired to mediate in this great injustice.
Garrett had little patience for slaveholders. He had little patience really for anybody who didn't believe in the immediate emancipation of slavery. And this really made him unique, I think, among Quakers, because he had an insatiable integrity when it came to this particular issue. And he took it to the highest levels.
An iron merchant of modest means, Thomas Garrett's home was located 2 strategic blocks from the Wilmington riverfront, in an area known as Quaker Hill. Garrett had long assisted fugitives making their way from this last critical stop to a network of Quaker abolitionists in nearby Chester County, Pennsylvania, and beyond.
We need to know that Thomas Garrett was totally committed to helping the runaway slaves, that he was emotionally tied into this. It dominated his life. And therefore, when he helped a runaway slave, he had to know that that slave was going to receive the best attention that it could get. And he knew that if he sent it to William Still, that's what was going to happen.
Garrett and Still may never have met face to face, but their extraordinary collaboration and ensuing friendship resulted in the safe transport of thousands of fugitive slaves. They supported the heroic work of Harriet Tubman, including the safe rescue of her own mother and father.
Garrett would send a trusted person with the letter often, and would introduce the person who was bringing the letter and would say something like, "This is a trusted friend." Could be an employee of his, could have been a free black man who was regularly helping out. So he would introduce people to William Still.
Dear friend, William Still, since I wrote to thee this morning informing thee of the safe arrival of 8 from Norfolk, another man from lower Delaware arrived since noon. Our friend Harry Craig will take the man, woman, and 2 children from here with him. Thee may take Harry Craig by the hand
as a brother, true to the cause. He is one of our most efficient aides on the railroad, and worthy of full confidence. May they all be favored to get on safely. I hope herself and her children may be enabled to find her husband, who was sold off some years ago, and that the rest of their days be happy together. I am,
as ever, thy friend, Thomas Garrett.
William and Ellen Craft were slaves in the state of Georgia. Their desire to be free was very strong, and for this jewel, they were willing to make any sacrifice or to endure any amount of suffering. As Ellen was fair enough to pass for white, they decided to act the part of master and servant. All that was needed to make this important change was for Ellen to be dressed in a fashionable suit of male attire, in a style usually worn by young planters. By muffling the face, it appeared as though the young planter had a toothache. With his right arm placed carefully in a sling, he would not have to write or register as they journeyed north. He would further appear to be lame and hard of sight, a young gentleman very much indisposed who need only put on a bold air of superiority and be dependent upon his servant. Arriving in Baltimore, the ticket master informed them that a bond was required before a ticket could be issued for any Negro traveling north. William responded that he knew nothing of the rule, but that any delay would endanger his young master, who needed medical treatment in Philadelphia. Without further parley, the ticket master waived the rule, and the young master and his faithful servant were safely in the cars for the city of brotherly love.
The desire for freedom could not be dampened. Determined slaves continued to take their chances on getting north, finding new and ingenious means of escape.
Henry Box Brown was a man of invention as well as a hero. He was an unhappy piece of property in Richmond, Virginia, when he decided that he could no longer remain in the condition of a slave. Brown hit upon a new invention altogether, which was to have himself boxed up and forwarded to Philadelphia. The door was locked. Mr. McKim rapped quietly on the lid of the box and called, "All right?" Instantly came the answer from within, "All right, sir." I will never forget that moment.
Pleased to meet you, sir. I waited patiently on the Lord, and he delivered. Yes, sir.
With the help of his abolitionist friends, Garrett had recovered from his financial losses. Activities on the railroad were now particularly dangerous.